morning, everyone, and welcome to Staffordshire Chamber of Commerce Business Festival. For those of you that don't know, my name is Laura Hodgkiss and I'm the event and training team leader here at the Chamber of Commerce. And we're delighted to have from Keele University today, Rob McKay, the Innovation and Leadership Development Manager, and Will Foster, Professor of Leadership and Director of MBA and Executive Programs with us today. And they're going to be doing leadership, paradoxes and snake oil, and we're delighted to have them with us. And for those of you that are watching it right here and now, it will be available on demand for those friends that you know or colleagues that aren't able to watch it as it goes live. So we're really excited to have them here today and here for the Business Festival. And with that all said and done, Rob and Will, it's over to you.
Thanks, Laura. That's wonderful. And it's really great to be with you today. Rob and I are going to take a bit of a format called a fireside chat. So what we're going to do is talk through our experiences and some of the ideas and theories of leadership. And it is an authentic fireside chat. I always like to show that there is an actual fire there. So we are doing an authentic fireside chat. But there's an academic called Simon Weston, and he said, all leadership is biographical. And he also said that it's important as leaders that we locate ourselves. And so what Rob and I are going to do to kick off is locate ourselves in terms of this leadership conversation. Simon Weston also said leadership ideas emerge from the messiness of a wide variety of settings rather than the tidiness of academic ideals. And I hope you'll find as we go through this conversation, this fireside chat today, that you'll realise that Rob and I are just as interested in the practice and the impact of leadership as we are the theory and the academic side. But just using that excuse of all leadership is biographical, Rob, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your your position in the leadership dialogue?
Yeah, sure. So good morning, everybody. My name is Rob McKay. I currently work for Keele as the Innovation and Leadership Development Manager. So I run a couple of programs there, the most significant in this context being the Mercia Centre for Innovation. So we develop leadership as a tool for encouraging more innovative thinking in small and medium-sized enterprises. Prior to joining Keele, I was at Staffordshire University for 6 years, 5 of those running the Exec Ed and Leadership Development programs from the business school down there. And then prior to that, I spent over a decade in the field of economic development and regeneration, mostly working with senior leadership teams on a variety of things, and from companies as small as 1 and 2 man bands all the way through to multinationals with tens of thousands of staff. So back then was when I became interested in leadership as a practical issue. Then I went to Staffordshire and it became a teaching and learning issue for me and an academic issue. And I'm still kind of in that space, and I'm really interested in, how people go about leadership.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. I'll sort of repay the compliment. So, from my point of view, I guess I originally trained as an electronics and software engineer and worked for Rolls-Royce for 5 years, but they very kindly put me through their sort of fast-track leadership development program, which meant I did a diploma in management studies and an MBA. And it was this. I'm showing my age now. This was in the early 90s. And I did a DMS and MBA that was experiential learning based on the Kolb cycle. We might talk about that a bit later. But it was brilliant, absolutely fantastic. And it really sparked a passion for me for leadership and organisational culture. And from there, I spent then 9 years at a boutique HR recruitment company, working with engineering and manufacturing companies across the UK and internationally, some of the big global brands and some of the very small owner managed businesses, seeing some of the very best and some of the not so good leadership and culture in action. And then that led into my academic career. I guess I've been in academia now since 2005. My PhD is on leadership and organisational culture, particularly that's in a particular context of the church. So again, I'm also an ordained minister, and I've worked voluntarily for charities as well. So I guess what I try to do is bring those different sectors of non-profit, profit, sort of corporate, non-corporate, into this dialogue about leadership. And like Rob, really interested in leadership practice as well as theory. But one of the things that Rob and I both agree on is the importance, and I say this to my MBA students all the time, it's really important to understand the theory and the history of leadership. And what I find with people who don't understand the history of leadership and the theory of leadership is that quite often the popular view of leadership can be quite narrow. So Rob and I are going to talk through just the briefest ever last century or so of leadership theory. And of course, leadership started way back. It's been in all the ancient civilizations, but the real theorizing of leadership, you could look back at the Greek philosophers. You might look back at people like Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince about political leadership. You might look at Sun Tzu's The Art of War. You could look at the Bible and look at Moses and his uncle Jethro telling him to lead and organize people. But I guess in the West, leadership theorizing came at the back end of the 1800s with someone called Thomas Carlyle, Rob.
Yeah, so this is when really, I suppose, a lot of our thinking about leadership, and especially here in the UK, but I think across most of Europe, was very much shaped by that kind of age of empire. And those sort of strong-chinned individuals who were going out and conquering various parts of the world, and planting flags on behalf of Queen Victoria and the Kaiser and so on. And that had a very militaristic bent to it, didn't it? And it had a very strongly structured and heroic angle to it, which I think, it still affects some of our thinking about leadership today, isn't it? This is what they call the great man of history approach, where, and I use the word man there very advisedly because it was a very male-dominated perspective on that. That leaders were great men, typically men, and that their leadership came from these kind of noble acts, and also that they were kind of born to it.
Yeah, absolutely, and the reason that it's so important to understand history is that even the language of great man theory today, as we struggle with gender and pay gaps and all that sort of thing, it's looking back at these sorts of ideas. And although no one might use the words great man theory these days, what we do see a lot in the press when leadership is talked about is that sort of heroic leadership sort of style, and this sort of kicked off looking at something called trait theory, which is the idea that actually leaders have certain traits, certain qualities, certain characteristics that they're born with, as Rob said, and regardless of their circumstance, they will rise up to be great leaders because they have these personality traits.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, that's a very superficially appealing way of looking at it. That there are those amongst us who are sort of called to greatness. They have the intellect, the strength of character, the drive to really be a leader. The problem for us as people who are in the industry of helping others develop their leadership is that it kind of makes us irrelevant. You're either born to it or you're not. And if you're not born to it, then there's no amount of hammering and chiseling that we can do to you. We ain't going to get you there. And that clearly can't be the truth, can it? Because we know that leadership is dependent on so many things, but not least of which is where and when it happens. You can't have great leaders without the context and the opportunity and the events that allow them to express all that.
Absolutely, and I think even at the time there were sort of staunch critics of Thomas Carlyle's theory, and they saw it as quite an immature and simplistic and erroneous way of looking at leadership. However, the trouble with leadership theory is if it sounds good and it sort of feels intuitive, people can jump on it and think it's true. So I think the next influence on all of this was the Industrial Revolution, and what we saw emerging out of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1900s was something called scientific management, and there are two thinkers, Taylor and Fayol, who were both industrialists, factories and mines, and they started thinking about leadership and management with respect to this very functional view of the world. Rob?
Yeah, so we're talking about the time of Henry Ford and the production line, and you can understand why thinking at the time was very much attracted to this notion of the organization as being analogous to the machinery that they were working with. It was all one big sort of mechanism, and that gives you a very kind of mechanistic approach to this. And I think, these scientific management people, and I think the term scientific management is probably very applicable here, because this is where we sort of start to see a split between leadership and management. And management is that more algorithmic, functional, decisions kind of make themselves at the right time. It's all part of the big machine of the organism kind of approach. Whereas leadership kind of springs away from this at this point, and it becomes a more organic and an art rather than the science side.
Yeah,
So again, it's all very rooted in the context of the time, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that started to happen is that the people who worked in these organisations were treated as units of resource. And we even call people now human resources. And there was an element of dehumanising people. They were there purely to do a task. And it began to create a them and us culture that perhaps hadn't existed in quite the same way previously. And this is where we start to find another interesting divergence, because what scientists and management theorists were interested in at the time was trying to get the best out of their employees. And there's a very famous experiment called the Hawthorne Experiment. And I'll let Rob talk a little bit about that.
So whenever you introduce Hawthorne Experiment, people think Hawthorne's the name of the experimenter, but it was the Hawthorne Electric Light Bulb Company. I'm trying to remember, there was Ohio, something like that, wasn't it? So very much sort of time and motion kind of things, and the management of the Hawthorne company were interested in making their staff more productive. So they brought in some of these scientific management people to do some experiments, change the context that the work was done in, to see whether it would improve productivity. So they did things like they brightened the lighting, and it would make productivity go up. And then after a while, it would sort of slip back to where it used to be. They introduced playing background music, and productivity would go up and then slip back to where it used to be. And they couldn't understand why pretty much everything they tried would provide a temporary boost to productivity. And then they finally figured out that what was happening was that when they made these changes, the people on the factory floor were thinking, oh, we're under observation again. And they would sort of be a little bit more diligent and a little bit more fired up, because they felt they were being watched. And then after a while, that feeling of being watched goes away. I mean, that's the whole premise of Gogglebox, isn't it? That people forget they're being videoed watching TV, and they let their guard down. So, this productivity dies away because people get used to it. We're not really being watched. Maybe people wandered off.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that being watched can be seen as a bit of an oppressive thing, but also there was another element going on, which is the people who were under the experiment were being singled out as special, and so they felt special by being selected, and so they worked harder. And I think even if they decreased the amount of light, productivity still went up, and so the conclusion of this was actually there are some social dynamic parts of being in an organisation that are not just about the functional tasks of getting it done. And this is really what sparks the HR movement and the interest in organisations as social places, not just functional places. And from there, we do see then quite an explosion of ideas around leadership. So, for example, we start to think about style and skills and behaviours. And from that point of view, you then begin to allow people to develop in their leadership, because before now, as Rob said, leaders were born and not made. But now, actually, if it's about the social dynamic relationships, if it's about the way that people interact with each other, then all of a sudden leadership is about influence, and influence can be extended in several different ways.
Absolutely. So this is the time when we see, for example, Kurt Lewin coming forward with his work on leadership styles. Lewin coming from the psychology side of things. So we're moving away from this kind of mechanistic view of the organization and focusing more on this kind of human interaction and how people interact. So we start off with Lewin, and he comes up with this study of young boys, wasn't it? It was late teen boys. I think they were army cadets or something, and giving them tasks, the usual kind of here's a rope and two logs, create a bridge kind of thing, and seeing what kind of leaders emerged. And there were those who were kind of the dictatorial type who would take charge, shout orders. There were those the collaborative type who would seek input from all their team members. So we start to see different approaches to leadership, and that opens up a whole vista of questions about how does that interact with the context. Is there a right way of doing this, or is there a right way for certain contexts? And I think it's a major step change, really, for the way in which we look at leadership at this point.
Yeah, and I think there's you can't exactly see where that tipping point was, because these things are not happening in a linear fashion. So it's not as though you get this theory, then you get that theory. And also, I always say to my MBA students as well, the challenge with leadership is that one theory doesn't displace another. So you've got all these theories sort of merging in and out of each other. And that's one of the challenges, that if it was nice and neat, there's the old theory, here's the new theory. The earth was flat before, now it's round. We've changed our paradigm. Then that would be great, because we'd all agree about what leadership was. But some of the challenges that we have in this leadership space is that there are many different perspectives. Rob's mentioned the psychological perspective, you've got the sociological perspective, you've got the business perspective, you've got the industrial. There's lots of different worldviews, or we call them epistemologies and ontologies as academics. But really what it's saying is people understand knowledge and gain knowledge in different ways, and they see the world in different ways, and that leads them to come up with different conceptions of leadership. But what it means is that when you start thinking about leadership as a process, then you can think about not just the leader. So we've got leader-centric views like trait theory and that side of things. But as soon as you start to think about leadership as a process, an interaction between social individuals, then you can think about the followers, and you can think about the interactions that happen. And all of a sudden that lends itself to some of the more recent, I'll say more recent, they're still several decades old, but situational leadership is probably one that really makes a difference to, when I'm teaching MBA students, and MBA students are senior leaders, they're in full-time work. Mm-hmm. So these are not just sort of full-time students who are younger, these are very experienced leaders. But often they haven't heard of things like situational leadership. And situational leadership was a concept that was created by Hersey and Blanchard. Rob, do you want to talk about situational leadership a little bit?
Yeah, so Hersey and Blanchard really latched onto this idea that you can't cookie cutter your leadership. You can't lead exactly the same way all the time. And I think that's a critical junction point. What they kind of mapped against was the fact that people and the people you lead are a context in themselves, and they will change. The team that you're leading on Monday morning will be a slightly different team to the team you lead on Friday afternoon, even though it's exactly the same people. The time of the week, challenges, what happens in between, your relationships, the things that people say, these all are interacting, and they are changing the way that team is. Now, teams go through classically go through a sort of 4-stage, forming, storming, norming, performing curve of Bruce Tuckman. But actually, although that's a little simplistic, they do mature, they do change. And a team that is coming together for the first time, new faces, no relationships, no legacy, is going to require a very different kind of leadership to a team that's been together for a long time, it's been through the fire, everyone knows what they're doing all the time. You're not necessarily having to direct that team in the way you would a less mature one. So that's the key of that sort of situational leadership approach, is that you are flexing the way in which you lead according to the people that you're leading.
Yeah, and Rob's talked about team, but you take this on an individual basis as well. And this is where the senior leaders really, as they start to look at how they've been leading without understanding this situational leadership, and then they start to adopt approaches with their staff members. Let's say, some members of staff might be very, very mature, and by mature I mean very experienced, very reliable. They know what they're doing, and actually, what Hersey and Blanchard say in that case, you let them you give them a little bit of direction, you tell them what the goals are, but you effectively let them get on with the job. Whereas there might be others that are extremely green, fairly new, fairly nervous. They may not be as confident or as capable at this point in time, and therefore your approach with them might be more directive. You might meet with them more often. You might be a bit more instructive, and there's a whole curve that if you look up Hersey and Blanchard, contingency leadership or situational leadership, contingency because they said it was contingent on the circumstances that you find. Yeah. And I guess that leads us on to ideas of transformational leadership. So again, the idea of transformational leadership takes this one step further and says, well, actually, as a leader, your job is to create a compelling vision and to win the hearts and minds of your staff and create those transformations that will bring staff aligned to that end goal so that they become self-motivated and self-directed.
Yeah, the thing that always interests me about transformational leadership is you can start to see the glimmers of having come full circle back to almost the great man approach, because there is this slightly heroic angle to the transformational leader, the way in which it's positioned, that you're there at the forefront, you're articulating this glorious vision of the organization and the world in which it lives going forward, and taking your people with you. And there's this slightly messianic feel to it sometimes. But the opposite of that is what they call transactional leadership, which is essentially, if I give you something, you'll give me something back, which is really a very kind of mechanistic approach again, and it's not good leadership, that's for certain, because there is no passion, there's no buy-in, there's no strong commitment from any party. It's very much based on the old quid pro quo.
And there is another form between transactional and transformational, which is pseudo-transformational. So if transformational, as Rob said, quite often transformational leadership is associated with charismatic leadership. Now, charismatic leadership was an idea that Max Weber back in the mid-1900s sort of came up with, and it comes from the Greek word charis, which means gift. And actually, if you've been around church, as I have, you know the word charismatic is actually gifts of the Spirit. You read the Bible, and the Greek charis means gift. So the idea was that these charismatic leaders had some sort of God-given gift, which is back similar to the great man theory that we talked about. But there's a dark side to this that will come on a little bit later, but I'll just mention it here, which is pseudo-transformational leadership. So if you think about transactional leadership, it's all very functional. Transformational leadership is about the power of the interactions and influence between the leaders and the followers. Pseudo-transformational leadership is where you look as though you're transforming things for the good of everyone, but actually your own self-interests are at the forefront of things. And this is where things can get a little bit dark, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll come on to that in a moment. Before we move on to the dark side of things, I just thought we'd mention a couple of other theories that are more sort of contemporary. Authentic leadership is something that is it's been emerging for a while, and this idea that as an authentic leader, you're not putting on a mask, you're not putting on a Hippocratic, you're not using hypocrisy, you're not saying one thing and doing a different thing. That actually, as a leader, what you see is what you get. So that's authentic leadership. And then there's servant leadership. A person called Greenleaf thought about leadership in a very different way, which is actually you start with leadership with the followers. You say, well, what do my followers need? And this is a little bit like we haven't talked about path goal theory, but path goal theory talks about, well, your job as a leader is to understand what the goals are. You're to help your followers understand what the goals are, and you're to create a path between where you are now and achieving those goals. And your job as a leader is to get rid of the barriers and the problems that exist. Well, servant leadership is whereas that might be a functional approach, servant leadership is more a holistic approach of saying, well, actually, my job as a leader is to serve the organization, and it's to serve the people. So you can plot self-interest and interest for others. And the idea of servant leadership is you move that pseudo transformational self-interest and you push it down to interest in others.
Absolutely. I think this is a good juncture to sort of revisit our title.
Yes.
The whole thing about paradoxes and snake oil. So we've given you a bit of a sprint through the history of leadership. And Will touched on this earlier, but there are some paradoxes within that. And the first one is that there are a number of different ways and theoretical ways of looking at leadership. And some of them mutually exclusive. Some of them seem to be quite old-fashioned, but they're all still kind of extant. And the field of leadership has this kind of dirty secret, which is that it lacks what we call paradigmatic consensus, which means essentially, as people thinking about leadership, we don't agree. There is no sort of Einsteinian equation for leadership. There is nothing that everyone goes, yep, that's leadership. That is, we are always at each other's throats, kind of, talking about what leadership is and how it works. So this kind of epistemology and ontology thing, it's epistemologically elusive and ontologically uncertain. We're not entirely sure how it works, and we're not that clear on what it actually is, which is why there's so much space, and that's one of the reasons why I think Will and I find it so interesting. We can get our way around this. That paradox creates the first of the snake oil opportunities, which is that, and this is very much from a praxis and in the real world kind of viewpoint. When people find themselves in a role, specifically a work-related role, that has leadership attached to it as a concept, either it's in the job title or it's an expectation, it's there in their job description, whatever, in comes the fear, because suddenly you're responsible for what other people do, and you're responsible for the big decisions, the decisions that come with a capital D. And that can be very nerve-wracking, in your career, when you suddenly start moving into management and team leadership in that first stage. But it can be, fairly terrifying at any point. And that opens up an opportunity for people to try and sell you the solution. You're a leader, this is how you do it. That way you'll be successful. So if you go into Amazon and type in leadership under the book section, I think you get something like 250,000 titles now. And it'll have everything from the leadership secrets of Winnie the Pooh through to the leadership secrets of Genghis Khan. And what is it about leadership that you can write sensibly about Genghis Khan and sensibly about Winnie the Pooh on the same thing? Well, it's about interactions. A lot of these airport style books and so on, the ones that particularly offer you the answer to leadership, take a very monolithic view. And I think one of the things that we've tried to show is that actually, if you explore the history of leadership, the thing that has come through is that it is not a fixed thing. It changes a hell of a lot. And that kind of introduces paradox number 2, which is that as an individual, and as a manager and a decision maker, one of the things that people value about you is consistency. They feel like they know which way you're going to jump on things. And what a lot of modern leadership theory and practice is about is being able to change what you do and not be the same all the time. And that can be a slightly unnatural thing for people to do. And I think that's one of the areas where I find it most interesting when we're working with working managers and showing them these theories, is that you see the light bulb go on that, I thought there was one way of doing this. I thought the way that I was doing it was okay. And actually, it's okay for me to do it this way, this day, and that way in that situation. So I think that's a kind of good point to raise there, is that whole issue of consistency. How leadership expects you to be inconsistent, and there's this balancing line between being reliable but also being adaptable.
Mm. And I'm actually taking time out from a British Academy of Management conference this week to be part of this festival and event, and I was in one session where they'd counted at least 650 different definitions of leadership. So you can understand, and that's just in one context. So 650 definitions. You are challenged with that, but as Rob said, I think the approach that we take is to say, well, actually, it's not saying this is good and this is bad. It's saying what we need to do is increase in terms of breadth and depth the understanding of our senior leaders and those who lead in businesses, those who lead in organisations, charities, sort of government bodies, wherever it might be that you're involved in leadership. If you have got a greater breadth of understanding, a greater depth of understanding, you can then draw on that to make sense of the situation that you're in, because actually leadership is about tools and skills, but it's also about sense making. It's about sort of entering situations that maybe you're unfamiliar with, having to make decisions that you've not had to make before, and being able to draw on a broad range of resources rather than having quite a narrow sort of view of things. But when you talked about consistency, Rob, I think that brings us nicely on to a real passion of mine, which is organisational culture. Yeah. And I think sort of you'd say, well, if leadership, John Maxwell said that organisations rise and fall on leadership. If you do nothing else as an organisation or as an individual, my advice is to invest in your leaders. If that's you as an individual, invest in your leadership skills. If it's you as a sort of chief exec or a managing director or a director or a manager, invest in your team, raise up their leadership skills, because I truly believe that it's the leadership capital of an organisation that will set it apart and give it that competitive advantage. But if you believe John Maxwell, who says organisations rise and fall on leadership, then the next question is, well, what's the most important thing a leader can do? And an academic called Edgar Schein, he brought in, he pioneered, he was the grandfather of organisational culture. He drew on anthropological methodology and brought that into organisations to look at organisations almost in the same way that an anthropologist would go to a distant country in a distant land and try and understand the culture of that land. He drew parallels between, and if you've worked in some of our organisations, they do feel like they're in distant lands, but using our same sort of techniques to understand the culture of our organisations. And what he said is that the most important thing that a leader can do is to occupy themselves with culture. That's to understand the culture and to be proactive in shaping that culture. And then John Connolly, who was the UK chief exec of Deloitte, which is one of the top consulting firms, he said that although in modern business there are, you can't really find a single silver bullet. There's no one thing that will absolutely ensure your business success. What he did say is one of the most important things is organisational culture. So if you pressed him, he would say, actually, of all the things that you could do, culture is the most important. And I guess this comes back to a Peter Drucker quote. Peter Drucker was another famous management theorist, and he said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what that means is that you can have the best strategic plans, you can think up the best plans for your organisation, but they will be undermined if you don't have the support in organisational culture.
Absolutely. And on the premise that we're doing this today for the chamber, and the audience is likely to be from the small business community. Coming back to your word about proactively shaping culture, and I think that's so important. Culture will happen whether you like it or not. As soon as you've got a group of people working together on anything, building a raft, whatever it might be, a culture will develop. It might be quite subtle. It might start in a very small way, but it will happen. Because what is culture? It's the way we do things around here. It's the way we interact. It's what we find acceptable and what we find unacceptable. Where are our boundaries? So it's reflected in the way people speak to each other, the language that's used, and so on. Now, as a leader, and as a leader of a small business, maybe 3, 4, 5, 20, 50 people, what you do and how you do it and how you go about your day will shape that culture enormously, whether you think about it or not. Now, there's this thing called the shadow of the leader, where the shadow you cast, and it's not necessarily a negative thing, but the way in which you do things will be reflected by the organization around you, because people will see that what you do is acceptable. So if you don't take control of that as a leader, then you might find that your own bad habits start to become embedded in the organization you've created. And we all know we have them. It's one of the things about sort of self-actualization and reflection is learning more about yourself and seeing yourself, as Robbie Burns said, as others see you, and then being able to understand how that feeds into the culture that you're creating in your workplace. I think that's a really important thing for especially people in the smaller business to understand, because there's the famous quote, isn't it, from the big American corporate CEO who had a presentation given to him by some consultants about organizational culture. This is fantastic. I want one by Monday. You don't have organizational culture happen in that way. It is organic, it develops, and you can either steer it and shape it, or you can let it happen by itself. And I don't think anybody would regard letting it happen by itself as being the safe option.
I think you're right, Rob, and I totally agree. I've worked for an entrepreneurial organisation myself when I talked about that boutique consultancy, and I think, let's talk about what culture is. Rob said the way we do things around here, which is probably the simplest and most concise definition you'll find. But if we unpack that, it's about the values, it's about the unwritten rules, it's about the assumptions that people make, it's about the traditions and the rituals, it's about the symbols. So if you're interested in culture and you are a leader in your organisation, what you can inadvertently do, as Rob says, is create a culture that's undermining where you want to go. So if you want an innovative culture, but your leadership style is autocratic, where you're always telling people what to do and you are quite dominant in that, those two traits, in my experience, don't create innovation and creativity. For innovation and creativity to flourish, people need to feel safe. I remember when I was in a previous university, and I'd taken over one of the areas, and I was sensing that there'd been quite a bit of harassment and bullying, and people felt quite trodden down. And so what was happening was we'd have some great projects and initiatives, but no one was really feeling safe to step up. And so we had to change the culture. We had to help people to feel as though these were safe spaces. So when you're in charge of a business, what I always say is that you're almost like the viticulturalist of your organisation. So that takes the idea of, if you pretend your organisation is a vineyard, for example, if you're creating really lovely wine, then that wine depends on the soil, it depends on how it's tended, it depends on how the soil's been worked over the years, it depends on the rainfall, it depends on many, many, many factors. But your job is to try and create the best environment, the best microclimate, as it were, for these things to flourish. The other example I use is a greenhouse. If all the windows in a greenhouse are smashed and they've got algae and you've got weeds growing up, you've got less chance of the seeds that you're planting growing into the plants, healthy plants that you want, than if you're tending that greenhouse yourself. So there's lots of sort of images and analogies that we can use when we think about organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we sort of touched on the way in which organisations will look back at sort of scientific management and tailor and fail. And then, for obvious reasons, organisations were seen as very mechanistic, as being like machines. Life and theory has moved on, and I think most organisational theory now sees these as being systems, in the same way that living creatures are systems and ecosystems are systems, and they are depending an awful lot on not so much the component parts that make them up, the ways in which those parts interact. And when you look at that as a social system, I mean, that's what culture is. The culture is the way in which the human elements of your organization interact. And coming back to where we started with consistency, that is something I think that really challenges leaders when it comes to culture, because of course you're shaping culture because things take root, because you are consistent. Which means if you find things in your organizational culture you don't like, you have to have a significant change. And change and leadership go hand in hand as subjects and as activities. And we all know that change is difficult, but change is difficult when you say, okay, well, this old machine's no longer working, we have to bring in a new one, it's not quite the same, and we have to learn how to use this one slightly differently. Change is even more difficult when you say the way in which we behave is not the way it should be, and we want to change elements of that. Which is why, it's very easy to bring in new product lines on a company. It's very difficult to do things to address equality and diversity, for example.
Yeah, and I think
going to the fundamentals of people.
I think it was the famous total quality management expert Deeming who once said, "Your system is perfectly designed to give you the results that you're getting." And I think it was Einstein who said, "Insanity is doing the same things over and over again and expecting a different result."
Yeah.
And I think when you start thinking about these ideas, so even though we said that the mechanistic view in terms of theory is out of date, the majority of people still think of organisations as in this mechanistic sense. We might not be conscious of it, and that's the difficulty. We're actually subconsciously thinking of it. But if you've ever heard someone say, "I feel like a small cog in a big machine," or you've heard of top down, or you've heard these other things, and again, we've talked about leadership and culture. Now, culture is as much about what's happening on the ground. But the thing is, it's the people in leadership positions who are deciding who gets promoted and how those processes work. It's the people in leadership positions who are deciding what the organisational structure is. It's the people in leadership positions who are deciding who gets the nice office and who gets the not so nice office. And all of these, when we think about social systems, start to talk about our next thing we wanted to mention, which is power and politics. Because as soon as you start talking about social dynamics, you can't help but sort of face the fact that if you're in a leadership position, you have an authority, and by definition of that authority, you have power. You have power over things, and you have power to do things. And so I just wondered, Rob, what your thoughts were in terms of these, whether it's large organisations or small organisations. Politics and power do surface at some point or another.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of an inevitable byproduct of human nature, isn't it, really? As soon as you have a group of people coming together, there are power dynamics that creep into this. I think it was French and Raven that came up with a categorization of types of power that are deployed within organizations. It's quite a nice way of looking at it. But it comes back to this kind of consistency and inconsistency, and leadership saying you need to treat different people in different ways at different times and for different reasons. And how we balance that against consistency as a fairness thing. Because as soon as you say, well, this person needs this office because and they're doing creative and want to have creative space, and someone else gets an office which is half the size and has no view out the window, you're creating a power dynamic. You're creating reasons for discord and disharmony to come in. And this is where we get into the hard stuff, isn't it? They say the soft stuff is the hard stuff. This is where the leadership challenges really arise. Is how do we manage those imbalances? How do we observe them? Know that they're going on. I mean, it's the first part of fighting any war is to know you're actually in one, isn't it? So yeah. It's understanding how these things will play out and where you go with them, really, how you run with those particular balls.
I think you mentioned French and Raven. I'd encourage people who are watching to go and do a little Google search. You'll find it, types of power. So they talked about things like positional power. So you have power because of the position you're in. You could have expert power. So this is the idea that knowledge is power. And this is why some people sort of keep very closed in terms of their job and not letting other people know what they do. You might have sort of negative power. So that's the power to stop something happening. So I would encourage you to go and have a look at that, because I think as you develop as a senior leader, if you're running a small organization, those power dynamics might not be absolutely obvious, but one of the brilliant things about thinking about culture and these types of issues is you're starting to think about your organization, not just as how it looks on paper, but something called the informal organization. And this is where I talk about fog lifting moments, that as you start to understand organizational culture and power and politics, all of a sudden, those frustrating and paradoxical and really sort of things that leave you scratching. You know, I work for Rolls-Royce, and as I say, I was in systems, I was in software and software person, and so I couldn't understand why seemingly illogical, stupid decisions were being made by the senior leaders. But as soon as I started to understand through the MBA, the power and the politics and the informal organisation, all of a sudden it was like the fog lifted, because there was the seen element of the organisation and there was this unseen element of the organisation. Of course, as you start to understand those things, you can then start to have influence on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what you're saying about authentic leadership earlier. You know, authentic leadership at heart is about being consistent in your values, that what you do and what you say match up. Yeah, it really is as simple as that. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I think what would be good to sort of wrap up this last bit is to talk about leadership right now, and particularly practice. You know, we've been through an extraordinary 18 months over last year, and it's been extremely challenging for leadership of all sorts, but it's also been quite interesting because it's thrown up some lessons and examples and observations. And I think there's a lot that will be picked over for years to come about what's happened. I mean, what would you take away from the last 18 months?
Well, I think as I've thought about this, there's been a convergence between the fourth industrial revolution, which is the digital revolution and artificial intelligence, all that sort of thing, and then a major global pandemic. And these two things have converged to create probably some of the most disruptive situations in our organisations that we've experienced since, you know, post-war. And I think there are some interesting observations. Certainly, crisis leadership. So there's not that much academic thought on. We talked about transformational leadership, but that sort of assumes that the person making the transformation is in charge of the process. And you mentioned change management before. I always say to my students, you know, I think sometimes when we use the term change management, it almost gives us a false sense of security that we can manage change. And my experience is that you can be involved in understanding change and you can be involved in leading change. But the moment you try to control it, and again, this idea of where the control lies is a big one, is a big one for us. So I think there's something about crisis leadership. I certainly think it's thrown up some social justice issues of myself and a colleague, Jack Chow, did this research project on decent work. And decent work, if you haven't come across it before, go and do a quick search. It's something that the International Labour Organization, it's part of the global sustainability goals. But decent work is what it says on the tin. It's about having good work. It's about people being able to go to work and have decent pay, decent conditions. But what we found as part of this project is that with COVID, it surfaced a lot of inequality, particularly around gender, and particularly around sort of lower pay. You know, lower pay people on lower pay who have less power. So I think that's another thing that's thrown it up. And I think one of the ideas that I've been bringing into this space is something that Rittel and Weber back in 1973, they looked at problems and they sort of found out that there were three types of problems. There were what they called tame problems, and tame problems were the very simple problems like I need to change a light bulb. Or that's a simple one. It could be more complicated than that. So it could be a head teacher trying to work out the timetable with loads of different rooms in their school, lots of different teachers, lots of different subjects, lots of thousands of students. But although it's complicated, we've solved those sorts of problems before. There are tried and tested methods for them. So that's one type of problem. Then they talked about critical problems. Now, critical problems are also like tame problems, but there's an urgency to them. So it might be, the initial Grenfell Tower disaster, actually putting that fire out was a critical problem. Our firefighting people, our police force, our ambulance force, they've all got tried and tested methods for dealing with that crisis disaster. But then they talked about wicked problems. And what they said, a wicked problem is different because it's more complex. It's not just, whereas a tame problem can be complicated, a wicked problem is complex because it's got lots of different elements, social elements, political elements, economic elements, legislative elements, technological elements, all interplaying with a problem. The problem, you've probably never seen it in that form before. You can't always agree on what the problem is, and you can't ever solve the problem. All you can do is bring different stakeholders together with different perspectives to come up with solutions to make it better. And the reason you can't solve it is that you change something for the good over here, and it has a knock-on effect for something for the bad over there. So again, I would say the pandemic was initially treated as a tame problem. It very quickly became a critical problem, but wrapped up in that critical problem was a really knotty, wicked problem.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, thinking back for myself, I think one of the first things that emerged, I'm thinking about the way in which I had to manage my own team in those that couple of weeks before we had the first official lockdown. And there was lots of, well, we expect lockdown, when's the decision going to be made? We just seen the horrific stuff that was happening in Italy at the time. And it really threw into relief the sometimes opposing demands of looking after your people and looking after your customer base, and essentially doing the work. And I think for the correct reasons, a lot initially was I'd look after the people. Their safety is key. We can pick up the work, we can catch up with the slack later on, but I've got to keep them safe. And then as we moved into working from home and all these kind of things, it was okay, well, now the things shifted back. Everyone's safe-ish, I've done what I can, but now we've got this thing where we've got commitments to people. We need to move forward with stuff. How do we solve those kind of problems? So that kind of care for your people, care for your organization, the old and some of the Ohio State studies back in the 50s, where there's this dichotomy between care for production and care for people, that came popping up to the surface again. So that was quite interesting for me at the time, and how that's resolved since. I think you're right. This whole thing about the critical, not critical, the wicked problem underpinning the changes that we've faced, and the one that's emerged is this whole, people talk about the new normal. The new normal is the wicked problem, because we don't know what the new normal really is. We all use the phrase quite glibly, but we're not quite sure what it really means. I think it probably means different things to different people in different organizations. We don't know how to solve it. You've got some companies saying, "Do you know what? We've saved a small fortune on office costs and travel costs, and that staff are as productive or more productive sometimes than ever before. That's it. We're binning that off. We're not going to have an office anymore." You've got other companies going, "Our income's from renting out office spaces. Where do we go with that?" I mean, it's an issue for us as a university, because we're very much a place-based kind of organisation. Particularly for Keele, which has this huge campus that brings people in, and the science park. It's how do we now resolve a way in which the whole world of work and education is looking at physical space in a very different way to the way it did 2 years ago.
And I think what I would say to leaders out there is, I came across this issue of wicked problems in more recent years. And what I realised is that I, in my historic leadership, was trying to solve wicked problems using techniques that were more suitable for tame or critical problems, and starting to think about that. It's not just that there's a different solution to them, it's actually a different mode of solving them. But one of the things I noticed, Rob, when you talked about the impact on management and leadership of teams, one of the other things that I think the COVID crisis in particular, and the technology working from home has raised for organisations, is that I think quite historically, managerialism is a parent-child relationship. If we think about transactional analysis, Eric Byrne, the game people play, he said that actually people relate to each other either on adult-adult, or adult-parent, or adult-child, or parent-child, or parent-adult. So there's lots of different ways people can react between parent, adult, and child. I think what the pandemic sort of disrupted was this managerialism tends to be that parent-child relationship. I am the manager. I know what's best for you. I'll write your job description. I'll tell you what to do. Now, within that, there's different ways. There's empowerment and there's other things. But generally, the underbelly of managerialism is parent-child. Whereas I think what COVID and the pandemic sort of moved us towards was more adult-adult relationship. So adult-adult relationship is more about mutual trust, and it's more about outcomes than it is about things like presenteeism. So I expect you at your desk between 8 in the morning and 6 at night, and that sort of thing. So I think it would be a shame to lose that move towards a more adulting culture in the world.
I think you're absolutely right. It's a really interesting one, because for me, one of the key differences between management and leadership is that, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier on about people getting the fear when they first get into being a leader and having expectations, is that as a leader, you are not really responsible for making the decisions. That seems an odd thing to say. What you're responsible for is that the decisions that have to be made are made, but they don't necessarily need to be made by you. It's your job to make sure the right people make those decisions, and that might not be you. This is the way we tackle as leaders wicked problems. Is that we go, I don't know, but I've got good people around me. It's my job to bring in other resources, whether that's people or other materials, to throw at this problem and to help people try and get their heads around it and understand it correctly for us. But it's not my job to stand and say we must do this, that, and the other.
I once heard a lovely phrase, which was, if management is about solving the problems and making decisions, leadership is about asking the right questions. And I love that idea that as a leader, I think it was Einstein that once said that if he got an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend the first 55 minutes making sure he was solving the right problem, and the last 5 minutes solving it. And I think, again, one of the challenges for leaders is to be asking the right questions of the right people, to make sure that as a leader, we are setting the scene for those problems to be solved in the most effective way. By, let's face it, the old top-down view of management was, the idea of management is to get the answers out of the minds of leaders into the hands of the workers, whereas more enlightened leadership is about recognizing that the people who are closest to the work are the people who are best situated to solve the problems and make improvements. So your role, and this is where, again, my MBA really changed my conception of leadership. Your role as a leader is more about being a coach, a facilitator, a mentor, and creating those conditions for your organisation to run in an optimal way.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the analogies I often use is the theatre director. Theatre director has a vision about how they want this play to go. They select the actors, they work with them to rehearse and to shape the script and so on. But on the night, the director isn't there. The actors get on with it. The lighting people get on with it. The sound people get on with it. They know what they're doing. The director doesn't pop up halfway through the performance and go, I just want to tweak something for the audience, because that's going to ruin the magic. So that is very much, for me, an exemplar of leadership.
Brilliant.
Well, I think we've kind of hit our hour.
Yeah. So
thank
Laura,
you very much to everyone who's been watching.
Thanks everyone for watching. Laura, thank you for inviting us to just chat about a subject that we're both passionate about and we both love. I hope it's been of some value to your audience. And of course, you can contact us at Keel if you've got any questions or if you'd like any more information on what we've talked about.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you so much, Will. And you can tell you're very passionate about what you do in leadership, and that shows exactly in the questions and sort of the answers that you were just flowing from you. And I think you probably could have talked for a couple more hours quite easily without
days, possibly.
any issues at all. I just want to thank you on behalf of the Chamber. Like I've said to everybody before, if you missed part of this webinar, don't worry, you can catch up on our on demand on the Chamber's website on our webinar library, and we look forward to seeing you both, and we look forward to seeing you all very shortly. Bye for now.